What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we have a review of Scorpions and their new album Rock Believer via Spinefarm Records. Now, in case you somehow don't already know, Scorpions are a pretty legendary German rock and heavy metal band formed in 1965 and now responsible for 20 albums spanning 6 different decades.
I'm too old for this shit.
So this is definitely a case of no matter how I feel about this one, there's likely a cult-like fan base ready to cast off any criticism as hater clickbait. But that's not going to stop me from sharing my opinion on these tracks, and who knows, maybe this one could even surprise me a little bit. Gas in the Tank unfortunately does not kick things off on a promising note with these recycled sounding guitars and random blaring siren effect. That's not even to mention the awful lyrics. I'm talking terrible. The overly upbeat chorus is bad enough, but when you unironically include the phrase wham bam thank you ma'am, it's gonna draw some snickers from this audience.
You serious?
Roots in My Boots, while admittedly great at getting its titular line lodged deep inside your brain, whether you like it or not, is also some of the dorkiest shit I've ever heard. Followed in kind by Knock 'Em Dead, which, while hard to really fault for the harmless lyrics harkening back to days of stretch limos going to big shows, just reminds me of the 80s rock version of a Star Wars convention.
Remember the Rebel base?
I clapped when I saw it.
I clapped when I saw Darth Vader!
Like, I can't hate this, since these guys and the people who love these types of songs are just sharing what feels like a very genuine love of the music from their Halcyon days, but that isn't gonna stop me from taking the piss out of it at the same time. Speaking of which, we haven't hit peak cringe yet because we still need to talk about Rock Believer, which was the first song I heard from this album. Again, positive message, very much a song for the long-time fans out there, and there's nothing wrong with telling people to believe in something, but does it have to be in the most generic and corny way possible? At least give me some riffs to chew on.
In the ruins of their souls, you saw the beauty of it all. Simply a generation change.
But as if to answer that plea directly, the album takes a pretty sudden and unexpected detour into music I actually dig, beginning with Shining of Your Soul, which does end up delivering on some actual hooks. This is more of what I wanted going into this album and actually does a great job of capturing those old 80s rock and metal vibes without the try-hard energy. The main guitar hook on this one has kind of an ominous atmosphere to it, and when paired with some of the vocal choices, wouldn't have been out of place on a Dio record. Furthermore, there is some pretty dynamic songwriting varying these elements up with ska chords, some seriously funky bass work, and a very fun harmonized guitar solo. Seventh Son then follows in this vein as well, slowing things down but continuing to deliver on what feels like a song that sounds like they wrote it decades ago. I love the big driving clunk of the bass, adding further punctuation to the plodding 4/4 beat as the guitars just wail away into the night with plenty of that old school reverb. Then they get my head bobbing once more with the Iron Maiden-esque triplets of Hot and Cold. This one dips back into the corny side of things with the chorus and isn't as tightly written as those last two songs, but it still feels more like a real song that could have been played on the radio back then. Unfortunately, we then shift back into the stuff I don't like with When I Lay My Bones to Rest, derailing back into a bland dime-a-dozen rock and roll song. There is so little character to this one that it might as well be 3 minutes of static. It's also around this time that I always grimace at remembering that we're only just halfway through the album since it has a whopping 16 tracks, which is way too long for most albums, let alone something like this. But we continue with Peacemaker, which ain't a bad jam at all, and is the superior of the singles. This one also has that same rock and roll energy, but this time written into something that actually sticks with me. The simple chorus of Peacemaker, Peacemaker feels like something I would sing along to on a Boston record. Very catchy, toss this one in with the tracks that I actually enjoy. But continuing to add on to the variety, Call of the Wild has more of a later Black Sabbath feel to it with its very groovy main guitar hook and vaguely doomy energy. I can almost hear what this one would sound like with Ozzy's vocals over it. Not bad at all, actually pretty enjoyable, even if it's maybe not one of my absolute favorites, but it is about 2 minutes too long and I could do without the Robert Plant orgasm vocals towards the end.
Stop it. Get some help.
Likewise, Know Where You Come From is another kind of Dio-esque ballad that's pretty solid, even if I don't have as much to say about it, other than it has some pretty wicked guitar dual solo action as well, in addition to the more morose atmosphere. Then Shoot for Your Heart whiplashes us back to basic rock tropes, and while not terrible, even kind of fun at times, doesn't stop me from wishing that the album was getting close to over at least at this point. Like, I seriously can't understate just how much this album could have benefited from trimming it down to a more concise 10 or so tracks. One of which should be When Tomorrow Comes, which definitely does deliver on some much needed personality, once more drawing parallels in my mind to the likes of Boston, Styx, and Journey. The whole thing is moved along by another super funky bass riff with lots of layering of the vocals and guitars that is genuinely impressive to take in. Unleash the Beast has a similar energy too, putting me back into a more positive state of mind. This track throws in a few curveballs with the instrumentation, as well as going for something a bit more atmospheric and even kind of mysterious, occasionally accented by the hard plucking of some additional stringed instrument. The vocal performance on this one isn't the best, almost sounding improvisational alongside the hypnotically swelling guitars of the verses, but on some level this only adds to my intrigue in terms of how it's so atypically constructed in comparison to some of the other songs. Yeah, I don't know, it's kind of weird but also sort of entrancing at the same time. I also love the big chunky palm mute transition around the 2-minute and 50-second mark, which may very well be one of the most overtly metal moments of the entire album. It's another standout track for sure, but one that's short-lived as we move into the final stretch with the kind of Aerosmith and Van Halen vibes of Crossing Borders and an acoustic reprise of When You Know, neither of which are bad but also don't do much to make me not want to cut them from the track list either. All said and done, there is actually a surprisingly solid album buried in here, you just have to be willing to find it. Honestly, the first 4 tracks feel as if they were written by an entirely different band, or at least at a completely different time. If I had my way, I would ditch those entirely and kick things off strong with Shining of Your Soul. It's completely bewildering to me that Rock Believer is one of the lead singles when I would probably go so far as to call it the worst song on the entire album. It's like, yeah, that's the title track, but you don't even need it. I think the best parts of the record portray the concept far better in a more unspoken way. It's like the difference between watching Blade Runner with or without the terrible narration track. But turning now to my 3 scales, I actually give this like an 8 for enjoyability. This is an interesting rating as there are some songs at a 9 and even a 10, and then there are a handful of like 6s. But averaging it out, I'll admit that I enjoyed this album way more than I expected, and a good 70% of it is actually a pretty damn good time. I give it a 9 for musicianship. For the style that they're going for, I was also impressed at just how well they still do it. I listened to that new Iron Maiden record, and it's very clear that it's not from the same era as the classics, but from the 4th track on, this genuinely feels like it could have come out during their glory days. And I give it a 7 for innovation. Shouldn't be a surprise here, as most bands this deep into their career aren't really looking to break a winning formula, and again, I am impressed from the songwriting to the production at just how well they managed to recreate the old formula. So an 8 overall and a kind of shockingly positive B- for me for Scorpions and Rock Believer. Speaking of Iron Maiden, check out this tier list I did reviewing the entire discography, or click here to hear more of my favorite metal albums from this month. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.